got to make a confession that I'm a Glastonbury virgin. I must be the oldest at 65 there's ever been. But my wife over there is nearly as old, so I feel in good company. However, I do have a number of children that have been here before, and they gave me this very, very wise advice. They said, my daughter's been a few times, she said, there are two things about Glastonbury, three things about Glastonbury, right? Don't take any pills, wear boots, and take wipes. Well, I got the boots anyway, so that's good. And it's definitely the first time I've given a talk in boots. It's not the first time I've given a talk surrounded by cannabis vapor, however, and I just hope I don't test me on the way out. Because although I will plead passive ingestion, but if I start to look wobbly, then maybe you should wonder about it. So I'm here for an hour, and I thought that maybe the best way of doing what I got to do today is to talk for about half an hour and then have time for questions, because I don't entirely know what will interest you about what I know about. My original plan was to, when I do talks like this, usually to slightly smaller audiences who are slightly better dressed, is to show slides. But they said I was up against the sun, which is actually quite a challenge to show slides against the sun. So if you want to see my pretty slides, you can go online. You know my name, yes? David Nutt, yeah. And there's lots of talks online. If you search D-Nutt and psychedelics, you'll find lots of images. So you can see the images afterwards. And I'll just talk about the background and the principles and why we're trying to do what we're doing. But I would like to throw it open for questions. Can someone over there ask me a question so I can hear if I can hear you? Good. Yeah, so we can take questions afterwards. So I'll kick off and I'll tell you about me and what we're doing, and then we'll take questions. So the first thing to say is I'm a psychiatrist, and as I like to tell people, the name like Nutt, there are not many jobs in medicine that are fitting. The men amongst you will realise that there is another one, but we tend not to go there. And I've always been interested in the brain, and it seemed to me that, like most of you, the brain is something that you cherish and you would probably like to understand more, but you'd also like to optimise, like to know how best to make your brain do the things that would be useful for you. And one of the most interesting and profound insights I had in my life was when I was about 15. And my father, who was a wise man, a civil servant, not an academic, but was a product of the war, so he didn't go to university, but he was extremely clever. And he was reading a book one day, and I came home from Scouts or something, and he said, "You should read this." And this was a description by a man called Albert Hofmann, who presumably you've all heard of Albert Hofmann. And it was Hoffman's description of how he'd accidentally pipetted a small dose of a substance called LSD into his mouth when he was working on it as a medicinal chemist. And that was a very important message because, of course, in those days, still at school, we were doing mouth pipetting like he did. But that's all gone now, so we won't have any accidents like that in future. However, Hoffman's accident was quite interesting because he was expecting, I think, nothing, but experienced a very profound alteration in consciousness. And his description that was really intriguing to me was not the fact that the world seemed different or that music was louder or more melodic or more important, but it was his description of how the cycle home, his normal 30-minute cycle home, seemed to take 7 hours. And I remember thinking at that time, well, that is intriguing, isn't it? So if obviously the brain works out what time is, and if a drug like LSD can change the way the brain perceives time, this has got to be a really important tool for studying brain mechanisms. If you want to understand timekeeping, then you probably should give people LSD and see how well they register time. And so those of you who go to work late regularly, you may just have some differences in those receptors, etc., that LSD work on. And I was so intrigued by that insight that I went back to school and I started talking to my teachers, and they said, "We don't talk about that here."
Oh, I said, okay, why is that? And they said, well, because it's illegal now. So I started asking, well, why is LSD illegal when it's such an interesting tool to study the brain? And of course, they couldn't give me an answer, and nor can anyone else. Anyone got the answer? Yeah, okay. There is no reason why LSD is illegal, other than the fact that the American government decreed it should be illegal. And that rather irritated me, because I've never been one to believe that politicians really had any better insights into life than we have. And in fact, in my 20 years of working with them, I know now I was right. And they have a lot less insight. So then a few months later, we had a show and tell at the school I was at, Bristol Grammar School. Any Bristol Grammar School people here? LSD, which I put up. This is because we're talking now about 1967, and with the whole of the Haight-Ashbury. Someone needs to tell them what San Francisco, the Summer of Love in 1967. Haight-Ashbury was the place where young Americans went to listen to the Grateful Dead and to take LSD, because they didn't want to fight this war in Vietnam. So the whole nature of music and art and to some extent politics was changing at that time. And anyway, I showed my molecule, and everyone else was showing things like benzene or ethanol, and I thought little more about it then. Yeah. But then a few years later, when I became a psychiatrist, I started working with people who were psychotic. And of course, there's been a theory for a long time that psychosis could be caused by something in the brain that is rather like LSD, because one of the experiences of psychedelic drugs like LSD is to make your brain work rather differently, to give you altered perceptions of vision or hearing or thinking. And there's been a long-standing theory that LSD could actually mimic psychosis, and that got me interested in the whole question of can we use drugs to explore not only things like the nature of timekeeping, but also to maybe model psychosis, so we can perhaps look for novel treatments, because we have treatments for psychosis, but the reality is there's only one kind of treatment, although there are many different drugs. They all work in the same way. And they're not wonderfully good. They are good for some people, but they don't help everyone. And they also have a lot of side effects. And in fact, something we are doing now, just as an aside, is we are doing a study using psilocybin, magic mushroom juice, to produce effects in the brain which are sort of similar to psychosis, to look for new kinds of approaches to drugs that might help people. The reality is, though, that when we look at the nature of psychedelic experiences in the brain, we know now that drugs like LSD and the precursors, drugs like psilocybin, and going back even further to drugs like ayahuasca, we know that they all work on a serotonin receptor in the brain. And there was a lot of hope back in the 70s that if LSD was causing psychosis, if we could block the receptor it worked at, then we could potentially have a new treatment. Unfortunately, that approach failed. It hasn't completely died, because interestingly, just a few months ago, a new treatment for a kind of psychosis which you see in people with Parkinson's disease has been licensed in the USA, based on blocking those receptors, those 5-HT receptors that LSD works on. So it's not been a fruitless exercise, but it certainly hasn't transformed the way in which we think about psychosis. But of course, over the next 20 years or so, the whole role of things like, particularly in disorders like depression, anxiety, and stress. When you look at the action of psychedelic drugs to stimulate these receptors, you see that they may, in some ways, replicate or even surpass the impact of more traditional drugs like antidepressants on these receptors. And that's actually one area where our research is going at present. Because some of you may know that we reported just a few months ago, and it's freely available online. If you just search Nutt and psilocybin, you'll find a paper in Lancet Psychiatry just a few months ago, where we did for the first time an experiment where we took people who had difficult to treat depression. Their depression had failed to respond to 2 conventional treatments, usually 2 different sorts of antidepressant, but in fact all but one of them had had psychotherapy as well. And then we gave them a single psychedelic experience with psilocybin. The dose was 25 milligrams, a fairly big dose, and they had quite a profound experience lasting 3 to 4 hours. And most of them, not everyone, but most of them felt quite a lot better. And some of them have stayed well. Some of them have stayed well now. We've done a 6-month follow-up, and some of them have stayed well for nearly 6 months. And that was really the first controlled trial of these drugs, or any of these kind of drugs, for the treatment of depression. But we're not the first people to think of that. In fact, the main point of my talk is I'm going to get onto now, which is that we have resurrected this kind of research, which was being done quite extensively back in the 1950s and 60s. And we've done it because, as I've already shown you, it makes sense to do it. And it is rather, well, it's distressing, and actually I think it's actually insulting, and it's outrageous really, that science and medicine and you people haven't been allowed to access this kind of approach simply because of the politics that surrounds psychedelics. So that's what I want to talk about for really the rest of my talk, but we can take questions on the medicine later. So let's go back in history. You could argue that modern Western society, is the only society in the history of humanity that has not used mind-altering drugs and encouraged the use of mind-altering drugs. You can see cultures going, native cultures in both the Americas, which dates back to something like 1500 years BC. Recreational value of many drugs. They really popularized and developed the way of cultivating and preserving wine. But they knew, like most of you do, that wine is not enough. And every year, towards the end of the summer, when the dews started getting a bit heavier, interestingly, a bit like you, the Athenian intellectuals and intelligentsia would, instead of coming to Glastonbury, they would go north. It was a lot drier there, interestingly, so it was called the Elysian Fields. So the Champs-Élysées in Paris is named after the Elysian Fields, which are north of Athens. And the Greek intelligentsia went north from Athens to the Elysian Fields, because in those fields they were growing on the rye and the barley that they were cultivating there was a fungus called ergot. And they knew that if they ate the ergot, they would get high. So they would go with the gift of Dionysius, the god Dionysius, who was the god of alcohol. They'd take their urns of wine and they would go and they would drink wine and they'd chew on the ergot fungus and they would have a wonderful experience. So wonderful that they recreated it on the images on their pottery, which is how we know about it today. And the reason they did that was actually in many ways the same reason as you come here. They wanted to escape from the city, they wanted to spend time in the country, but they also wanted to have a different way of thinking. They wanted to change their thought processes so they could go back and carry on doing the same stuff they did before, but perhaps better. They kind of wanted to cleanse their mind. They wanted to make themselves better, improved, different. And you think, well, that sounds like quite a good idea, really, doesn't it? What should we do today, dear? Well, let's go up to the Elysian Fields and have a couple of days, drinking and taking psychedelics. And then what? Well, we'll come back and then we'll build democracy. That would be a good thing to do, wouldn't it? And they did. And they wrote, of course, they developed concepts which still. So we know that these drugs, if used appropriately in a socially acceptable way, can have huge benefits to society. In fact, you could argue, I'm not sure I'd go this far, but you could argue that Western society is built out of that kind of experience that the Greeks may well have gotten from taking psychedelics. So where did it all go wrong? Well, that's a really quite difficult question to answer, but I suppose we have to blame the Romans, because they took over Greece and they were rather more militaristic and a bit more sort of rudimentary in terms of their perspectives on life, and they like fighting rather than thinking. And to some extent, the subsequent 2,000 years have been limited in terms of people's access to these drugs and to the knowledge of these drugs. And we've tended to rely on alcohol. And of course, alcohol is a great drug. You know, I guess we've all used it, yes? Yeah? Yes, a few of you haven't. Maybe. Sometimes I give this talk and there are some people who've never used alcohol, but they're relatively few. Alcohol is pervasive in our society. It has been for a very long time. And one of the problems with alcohol, one of the reasons alcohol is so pervasive, is that it figures so strongly in the Bible. In fact, as hopefully you will know, I mean, I'll give you an example. The reason alcohol was so powerful in ancient times was rather, it's rather shown by what's in the floor in front of us. In those days, if you drank water like this, you'd probably die. Whereas wine was one way alcohol killed the bugs in it. So alcohol has been life-saving in terms of providing drinking fluid. But of course, alcohol has also become part of the symbolism of our religion. So Christian religion has used alcohol. The wedding at Cana, what did Jesus do? Well, he made the wedding go well because he turned water into wine. Because wine, the tradition of Jewish weddings at the time was to have wine to celebrate. And the church then, of course, took that accepted drug, and it turned it into part of the religious ceremonies. So, I mean, if you take communion, in both, all, certainly Catholic and Anglican communions, you drink wine. And whether you believe that's the blood of Christ, or it's a symbolic, it doesn't matter. The fact is, the church has had a hegemony on drugs for the last 2,000 years. And more recently, it's changed, and it's given that, thanks, I got one here. There it is. Am I sounding dry? Yeah. And the church has evolved into the drinks industry, which started with the church, and then became a separate industry. And the drinks industry is extremely keen to keep its monopoly over drugs. And it's fought battles over the last 150 years to make sure that no other drug really got on the market. When accessible versions of drugs like opium and cannabis and cocaine became available to the public, systematically the drinks industry has created opposition to them, created fear about them, and eventually got them banned. The reason we as a society that doesn't use mind-altering drugs is largely because of the pressure that the drinks industry put on politicians to maintain their stranglehold on the control of these substances. And that's extremely, that's immoral, personally, I think. I don't see it can be any justification for limiting people's access to substances that change their mind, particularly not if you do it on the pretext of harm. And this, of course, is where the whole story gets extremely murky. Most of the justification for keeping drugs illegal is because supposedly they're harmful. But as you know, and hopefully some of you have read some of my work over the years, most of the so-called illegal drugs are less harmful than alcohol. And that's therefore wrong. That is so scientifically that the justification for that illegality is wrong. And of course, it was my protesting the government's continued resistance, intransigence to having a rational drug policy that eventually got me sacked as their advisor in 2009. And there's an interesting sort of... And when you look at the three pillars that underpin the restrictive attitude and the very hostile attitude that society has to drugs. You see, there are politicians. Most of the politicians know that drug policies in this country are wrong. Many of the drugs ministers have said so, but they only say it when they've left office. They never say it when they're in office. But we know that probably the majority of politicians know that they're lying about drugs. It's probably because they know they're lying about most things, but that's another story. And then, of course, we've got as I said, the drinks industry. The drinks industry has been systematic, particularly in the last 30 years, in trying to prevent access of cannabis and drugs like MDMA to any kind of legal market, because they're terrified that it'll undermine their profitability. And then the third arm in this rather dangerous and very effective opposition have been the media. And we have a peculiar media in this country. I don't know. Some of you look rather young. You probably don't even know what a newspaper is, but believe me, there are such things. And they have a lot of influence amongst older people, particularly older voters. And newspapers such as the Mail and the Sun and the Telegraph have systematically tried to create hysteria about drugs. And they've done it for the last 30 or 40 years, and they continue to do it. And that's why we have the Psychoactive Substances Act, which I'll talk about in a minute. So newspapers, politicians, and the drinks industry together are a very disturbing and very powerful coalition. And they really have held us back. And there are a lot of people who've been punished and prosecuted because they've dared to challenge that authority. But beyond that, there's a whole other story, and this is really the key of my talk, which is that not only have we, by trying to regulate recreational use of these drugs, unfairly criminalized a lot of people. There are 1 million young people in this country, probably a few of you in this audience, again, judging by the smell, who've got criminal records for smoking cannabis. But we created an underclass. But actually, truth is, the cannabis underclass probably can't afford to come here. So, because this 1 million people who've got criminal records for cannabis possession, they don't have work jobs. They really struggle to get work, and they are extremely disadvantaged. But beyond that, we've created another underclass of people who've got medical problems for which they cannot get access to treatments. And almost all the so-called illegal drugs that the newspapers know the names of or can spell, cannabis, MDMA, LSD, I was going to say psilocybin, but I don't think they can spell that, but those drugs that are illegal today all have huge medical potential. And to deny access of patients to their therapeutic possibilities even if these drugs were dangerous, it would be outrageous to deny patients who should be allowed to make their own minds up about the relative risk-benefit. But when these drugs aren't dangerous, when you have a drug like cannabis, which is safer than alcohol, to deny it to patients, to break down the doors of people with multiple sclerosis, just to find that they've got some cannabis and to prosecute them, happens on a regular basis. To my mind, it's ridiculous. It's actually, as a taxpayer, it's insulting. Why should my money go to giving police overtime so they can smash people's doors down at 6 a.m? I don't want my tax money spent on that. And why should these people who have got no other recourse other than to a so-called illegal drug, why should they be subject to that kind of harassment? What kind of society does that? And why do they do it? And of course, as I've said, I've told you why they do it. They do it because politically, it's powerful. The people that take drugs tend not to vote, so it doesn't matter if you lose their votes. There's a powerful lobby against them through the drinks industry. And also now, and even more so probably, depending on what happens in the restructuring of the Conservative Party after the Brexit, it may become even more right-wing. There's a strong American puritanical influence funding groups in Britain, particularly the so-called Centre for Social Justice that Ian Duncan Smith runs. This Centre for Social Justice has funding from somewhat arm's length from American charities which derive their income from the defense and military industry. And their ambition is to make sure that the world becomes or stays as much American as it can. And that is truly, that isn't democracy at all. And we really need to make sure we don't fall prey to the simple semantics. I mean, it's great, isn't it? Why would you not have a Centre for Social Justice? But what they mean by social justice is you've got to do what they say, and that really is not do anything other than drink alcohol. And where does all this really come from? Well, it comes from an interesting period in our life, which I've already alluded to, the 1960s, and the Vietnam War. Because the reason LSD is illegal is because it was changing the way people viewed the war. Now, again, I'm looking around here. A lot of you weren't even born. Some of you weren't even thought of before the Vietnam War. But anyway, the Vietnam War was the last war the Americans fought to try to maintain the world order through their military might. And they fought it in Vietnam, which is why it's called the Vietnam War, and that's a place over in Southeast Asia, and which most Americans didn't know about. They didn't even know where it was. But they were young American men, your sort of age, were being told to go and fight. And initially there was voluntary service, and then so many were getting killed that people wouldn't volunteer anymore. So then the American government decided it had to have conscription. So basically, if you were over 18 and I remember this vividly, I remember on the television watching this. If you were born on an odd day of the week, an odd day, if your birthday was an odd day of the month, you'd get conscripted and you could go to a foreign country that you'd never heard of really, or at least you didn't know where it was, and you'd live in a jungle, being eaten by mosquitoes and cockroaches, being shot at by an enemy that you didn't ever see, fighting for a cause you didn't understand. And it's not surprising that many young Americans said, I don't want to do this. And then they went to Haight-Ashbury, they went to San Francisco, they dropped acid, they listened to the Grateful Dead, and they thought, this is a better world. I actually don't want to be a soldier, I don't want to be in the military, I don't want to kill people for no reason at all, other than they have a different belief system than me. And LSD was the first drug to be banned simply because it changed people's perception. Because even then, the Americans could not ban a drug just because they didn't like it. So they had to create hysteria about it. And they did. The American press was remarkable, even better than the Sun, in creating hysteria. They created ridiculous levels of hysteria about LSD. It's not even clear to me whether anyone ever died of LSD. We know, obviously, that even back in the 60s, tens of thousands of people were dying from alcohol and tobacco every year. But the American government decided to collude with the newspapers, create hysterical stories. Woman gives birth to a frog. LSD-fed ape rapes TV actress. Sort of utterly absurd kinds of headlines like that. And you might say this is laughable. It's laughable that anyone could force us. But that's what they did then, and that's what we have just done now. Some of you know, yes. May the 27th, this country, your country, the country that you voted you voted into power, the Conservative Party, this country has done something that no other country in the world has ever done. It has banned any drug that changes your mind. Whether that drug exists today or whether it will ever be made in the future, irregardless of whether it's harmful or not. I mean, do you know that? The Psychoactive Substances Act became law on the 27th of May, and essentially everything's illegal. I think even holding your breath for more than 30 seconds to get high is illegal. And it's hard to talk about this without kind of gagging, really. How can a country like ours, which has got a tradition of liberty and scientific endeavor, how can it do something as utterly controlling as that? And the answer is very simple. The answer is because the Sun told them to. The Sun created hysteria, has over the last 2 or 3 years created hysteria around the use of nitrous oxide. The reason it's done that is because footballers use nitrous oxide. Footballers use nitrous oxide because it's the only drug they can't be tested for. So they're not as dumb as you think sometimes, are they? But the Sun didn't get hysterical when Prince Harry used nitrous oxide, but it got very hysterical when Raheem Sterling used nitrous oxide. And the Sun has had a campaign over the last few years to get nitrous oxide banned based on the fact that footballers use it. But banning nitrous oxide was difficult. They also, of course, there have been other legal highs, such as mephedrone and other stimulants, and also synthetic cannabinoids which have come along. And those have all been grouped together as in the term legal highs, and the campaign to get rid of them has led to a law which bans everything other than alcohol, tobacco, and caffeine. And that's outrageous. It's truly outrageous. And when I speak to friends around the world, they say, you must be joking. You can't ban things that don't exist, but you can, and we have. And the reality is anything that affects your brain now, whether it's being discovered and used for treating illness or recreational use, is de facto illegal, because that's what the government said. And that's going to have a massively deleterious effect on research, because it's been really difficult to do research with psychedelics now. They're illegal. Our psilocybin study, so we managed in the end to treat 20 patients with psilocybin. It took us 2.5 years to go through all the regulations to get psilocybin to give to our patients. Each dose of psilocybin ended up costing £1,500. Now, there is no drug in the world that's that good. Why is that? Because when I work with psilocybin, I am treated as a criminal. They assume that, and as are all my colleagues, it's not just me, no, I mean, we have to have special police checks. Only 4 hospitals in Britain are allowed to hold cannabis because it's deemed as too dangerous. I'm a doctor, I can prescribe heroin, which is massively more dangerous. 1,300 deaths a year from heroin, no deaths from cannabis, but I can prescribe cannabis because I'm a doctor, heroin because I'm a doctor, but I can't do anything with cannabis because it's controlled as a Schedule 1 drug, like MDMA, like psilocybin. This is utterly, utterly stupid. It's a waste of your money because you funded my research, thankfully, or at least those of you who pay tax did. Yes. And it holds the field back. We are the first people in 50 years to have done a study with LSD in this country. We did it. Thank you. Thank you. We did it. People say, why did you do it? And the answer is because it had to be done. You can't have a drug which changed the world. You can't have the only drug to be banned because it changed the way people think and not understand what it does in the brain. And of course, the study has been remarkable. We've understood the nature of hallucinations now. We've understood the nature of the change in ego, the sense of becoming part of the universe that these drugs produce, and you'll hear about from the next speaker. We can now show you a brain map that makes sense of this. And I think that's critical, because we cannot win the argument about drugs by relying on common sense. You've seen that. We can't even now win the moral argument. This government has told us that taking drugs is immoral unless you take alcohol. Any other psychoactive drug other than alcohol that changes the way you feel is illegal. So they've made that moral decision. They told us it's not based on harm anymore, it's based on morality. So we can't win the moral argument. The only way we can win the argument is through science. We have to show them, scientists like me have to show them, that the science is really worthwhile. At the very least, these drugs should be made available for medical treatment and research. And whether they go into recreational use or not, who cares? Because the reality is they're not dangerous anyway. Thank you very much. So if we've got 15 minutes or so for questions, if people want to ask. Yes, down here.
If you had complete control, you were Prime Minister, the majority, and you could choose how you would enact drugs policy.
Yeah, so the question is, they asked me that question in the Independent yesterday, but I couldn't write it. I mean, I had a slight domestic. My mother died yesterday, unfortunately, so I'm not staying. I'm just come to give this talk, and then I'm going to go home and sort things out. But they asked me to do that. But I will do it, and I'll tell you what I'd do. What I'd say that the reality is this, that the question was, if I was Prime Minister, I'd be better than Boris anyway. What would I do? What I'd do is very straightforward. I would apply science, I'd apply rational approach to drugs. I would use good policy, which we have seen developed elsewhere in the world. We've got good models now. It's not that we're going into the dark by saying, make medical cannabis available. 2/3 of Americans, that's 220 million people. The richest people in the world have access to medicinal cannabis. But in Britain we don't. Why don't we have access to medicinal cannabis? Because the drugs minister thinks if we had medicinal cannabis, it would encourage you not to use cannabis. Like some of you clearly aren't taking notes. I would say this. I would say, based on the knowledge we have of drug harms, drugs which are less harmful to the user than alcohol should be available. They should be available in a regulated fashion. And I say that for two reasons. I say that for the moral reason. Why should you, those of you, what strength is that you're drinking? What's that Magnus?
4.5.
Yeah, you see, that's like a half a joint, you've got to be very careful. If alcohol kills 26,000 people a year in Britain, premature death, a lot of them young people. So anything that's less harmful to the user than alcohol, I think we have a moral right to make available. And we should definitely ban wine boxes. Those are see, that's, yes, we should limit the sale of alcohol to small units. So there's the moral argument, but there's also the health argument, that I believe that if people had access to drugs such as cannabis and such as MDMA or other stimulants, and nitrous oxide even, in quantities it wouldn't harm them, we would actually have less harms. Alcohol is a hugely expensive drug. It costs $6 billion or more a year just to police drunkenness, and not here obviously, but on the streets of our cities itself. So I think we should have a regulated market. We should control alcohol. I think alcohol is too cheap. What you're drinking is, you're paying 1/3 the price I paid when I was a student for alcohol, and that's why consumption's gone up. Last year in Britain, there was a 6% increase in mortality in women from alcohol. 6% in 1 year in mortality. Alcohol is the leading cause of death in men under 50 in this country, and it'll be the leading cause of death in women under 50 by the end of this decade. So we have to control alcohol, and the way to control alcohol is to give people access to safer drugs, not to stop access to other drugs. So that's what I do. But drugs which are more harmful to the user than alcohol, so drugs like heroin, crack, cocaine, I would still keep illegal, hoping that sensible people like you would then switch to something like MDMA or nitrous oxide. Right? No, any other questions? Yes. So the question is, what can you do to help ordinary people? You're not ordinary people. You're very special people. You've taken a whole hour out of your precious Glastonbury time to come and listen to me. I'm very touched by that, and I think it's. I would like you. How many of you follow me on Twitter? How many of you know what Twitter is? You could write it in the mud, I think, and then it. No, so I'd like you to all follow me on Twitter, Prof. David Nutt. That's pretty easy, isn't it? Yeah. Because that way I can tell you what issues are happening, when things are going on. And I think I'd also like you to follow drug science. When I was sacked by the government from the ACMD, I realised that something had to be done, because once I'd gone, there was no voice. I was pretty certain that the people that followed me on the ACMD would not dare step out of line, because they'd seen what happened to me, and they would have been cowed by it. So I thought, we've got to do something different. So I decided what to do was I set up a charity called Drug Science. So you can follow Drug Science, it's online, and if you want, if you think like what we do, you can donate. It's a charity, it gets by on things like my lecture fees and donations. Follow us, because we are beginning to develop a kind of campaign which at the very least will educate people. The great thing about Drug Science is it's now where journalists go. If journalists want to know about drugs, they come to Drug Science. And I'm inundated, as I say, 3 or 4 times a day I get a journalistic inquiry to do something. And the more power to Drug Science, the more we can actually be the voice. And if we're the voice, it's much harder for newspapers like The Sun or The Mail to lie about drugs. Because if other journalists ring us up and they say, well, what's the truth? We tell them the truth. So if we've got to stop the disinformation that's been so powerful in terms of driving drug policy. So that's the first thing you do. The second thing you can do is there's a book called Drugs Without the Hot Air. Any of you heard of that? You've got it, good. Drugs Without the Hot Air, good. Then next time, if I'm here next year and you're here next year, could you all bring your copies so I could sign them, please, right? That's a very important book, because that book supports my charity. All the proceeds go to my charity. I wrote it, by the way, in case you're wondering who the author was. And that's the book that most of you, should give to your parents. Some of you perhaps not, some give to your children, but most of you give to your parents, right? Give them to your parents and say, Mum, Dad, this is your Christmas present. This book will change the way you think about drugs. And by the way, if there's anything you don't understand, speak to me and I'll explain it to you. So you want to begin a dialogue with your parents as well as educating them. And use that book as a template for having this dialogue, because we need to have a dialogue. There is so much misinformation from supposed reputable sources like newspapers that we have to challenge it. And I can't, I do my best, but if all of you are challenging it, every time someone lies about drugs, you say, hang on, but read the book. Go on the drug site, drugs out, okay? Yes. You have to shout, I can't. Yeah, what do you say to young children? No, this is really, there's a chapter in it. Yeah, no, there's a chapter in it, and I start with 4. I think children need to learn. One of the saddest things we have in this country, the last government removed any directive, they removed any requirement to teach about drugs at school. That's disgusting. The only materials that teachers don't have to teach about, schools don't have to teach about drugs at all. If they want to teach about drugs, the only free material they can get is provided by the Scientologists. And they give a lot out. It's outrageous. There is no government-sponsored support for it. Well, it's one of the things Drug Science wants to do. If I get funding, we would set up a schools program. But you've got to start before. Look, as soon as children see their parents usually being drunk or stoned, they need to know what's going on. A lot of kids at 4 or 5 will be going to school hungry because their mother's drunk and hasn't woken up, or they'll be beaten up by their father. Kids need to know about drugs from the very early, because it impinges on so many people's lives. So the book is in there. What do you say to a 5-year-old? Well, you tell them that people get intoxicated and they can do bad things, and if they're getting beaten up by a drunk father, then they should talk to the school. At every age, you should be approaching the truth. And one of the people say that, well, drugs education doesn't work. What they mean is drugs education doesn't stop people taking drugs. Well, that's not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is stop people being harmed by drugs. And this is one of the worst things for the last 10 years, we've had both this current government, the last government, and the last Labour government. Their drugs policy, which we opposed continuously, had the sole measure of success was why not? Because it's not a drug. Why do you want to stop people using drugs? Because they're harmful. But if they're less harmful than alcohol, won't we reduce net harm? We're not going to talk about that, or we're going to lie about it. So the premise is that if we stop people using drugs, there will be less harms. So I say to them now, right, okay, so you think there's less use of drugs. Okay, well, how come Deaths from cocaine reached an all-time high last year. Deaths from heroin are going up. How come that's happening? And there is no relationship between use and harm, because what we're doing is we're actually increasing the harms of drugs in the people who are using by these policies we've adapted, and having it all in the black market. So I suppose the bottom line is you've got to have a more rational government. Now there is hope. Don't give up. The Lib Dems, some of you may know, they did exist. There's 8 of them left. And there's one other, there's a green lady called Lucas from Brighton. 6 of the Lib Dems and Caroline Lucas have endorsed a policy document legalizing cannabis that I helped put together, which was endorsed by the Lib Dem Spring Assembly. And there will be a debate in Parliament about it. So we've got 7 MPs that are openly supporting legal cannabis. Make damn sure those of you who are in their constituencies, you vote for them, please. One more? Yeah. So the question is, how can we use social media to try to promote and develop the vision of drug science? I should say, it's important, drug science is a charity, it's not just me. I've got a whole group of real experts. Almost all the experts on drugs in Britain are on drug science. Unfortunately, that's one of the reasons the government's laws on drugs are so bad, because even when, they don't even make the laws correct, they're not even chemically correct. The latest law on cannabis, you might be interested in, on synthetic cannabinoids, the latest proposed law on synthetic cannabinoids currently captures something like 35 licensed medicines under this act. The government doesn't even know its own laws. It doesn't even understand what it's doing. So, because most of the experts work for drug science. So we're communicating. So I tweet, Drug Science has a website, we do Facebook. At some point, we will have a campaign. And so we're going to, what I'm trying to do now, I think the key issue, the big, for us in this country at present, is a technical issue. And it's about how we can get cannabis, medical cannabis available. And all it takes is for the Home Secretary to write a letter, or write what's called a statutory instrument, and say that cannabis is no longer a Schedule 1 drug, which means you have to have a special license, which takes a year and costs £5,000 to hold it. But it's a Schedule 2 drug, alongside heroin. So we could store cannabis alongside heroin in our pharmacies, and not worry too much, because if people are going to break into that pharmacy, they're not going to take the cannabis, are they? Yeah. If we make cannabis a Schedule 2 drug, like the Americans are almost certainly going to do this year, that would make it a medicine. And add a stroke. And it doesn't even need a vote of Parliament. We can just have the Home Secretary saying, yep, there's enough evidence, it's a medicine, let's put it back in the medical category, Schedule 2, or immediately that would happen. So we need a campaign for that, and everyone should, if we start a campaign, you should really sign up for that. When, at some point, that's going to happen. 100,000 people have signed the campaign, the petition called Ease Our Pain, at least over 100,000. So there will be a debate in Parliament about cannabis and medicine. And then I think we should do the same for psilocybin, because we've now got this good evidence of its value in depression, and MDMA as a medicine for post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think if we could all push for just those 3 drugs to be put out of Schedule 1 into Schedule 2, we could really make a huge difference to a lot of people fast. So follow me again on Twitter, please. I want to see at least another 1,000 signed up tonight. Last question. Do I think Brexit's going to make any difference? Well, it's going to make a difference in a number of ways. It's certainly a distraction. One thing about Europe, whatever you think about Brexit, the European Directorate of Justice, they developed a policy 5 years ago based on the harm scale that we developed. And they said all new drugs should be assessed under the harm scale. And if they're very harmful, they should be criminalized. If they're moderately harmful, they should be subject to civil sanctions. And if they're not harmful, they should be legal. And our government, my scale, and our government said, no, we are not interested in doing anything that Europe are doing on drugs. And of course, we've gone on now to make everything illegal, even if it's harmless. So Europe was good for drugs because Europe is rational. Most European countries, particularly Netherlands, Belgium now, Spain, Portugal, they have much more rational drug policies. So I think Brexit could actually make things worse, because if we end up being controlled by these ultra-Puritan right-wing American lobby groups, it could be more problematic. But who knows? I mean, so, I'm not optimistic, but don't give up, because you never know. Something, there might be a chance for change. You'll have to say it a lot louder. My synthetic alcohol, well, this is an interesting... So it seemed to me a few years ago, 10 years ago now, 11, we were writing a government report called the Foresight Report on drugs and the brain. And we were brainstorming for a year on the future of drugs. And I spent most of my professional career actually working in the field of alcohol dependence. And for the first 20 years, I was trying to treat people with alcohol dependence. I was trying to stop people being intoxicated, stop people craving, stop people dying of cirrhosis. And then during this brainstorming process, it kind of came to me, well, we can never do that. Alcohol is intrinsically toxic. For those of you who drink, there's only a few of you here, I see, this is good, but let me just tell you, sir. If alcohol was treated like a food additive, suppose one day, suppose alcohol didn't exist, and suddenly you discovered this wonderful solvent which you could put into trifles to make them taste better. Yes, you said, I'm going to make my fortune selling alcohol trifles. You'd go to the Food Standards Agency and you'd say, can I sell this? And they'd say, do toxicology testing. You do toxicology testing. And you'd come back and you'd say, can I sell it? And they'd say, yes, you can sell alcohol. It is toxic. So the maximum exposure in a year for alcohol, if you treat it like other food additives, is a glass of wine per year. So we know that. We've known that for quite a long time. The reason we don't enforce those rules is because it's not a food additive. It's a food, and it's exempt. And that's the problem. We blind ourselves to alcohol. So, 4 million premature deaths a year from alcohol. We could get rid of almost all of those by replacing it. I know the science we've done could give us. It has given us. I've taken it. My wife has taken it. We had parties over Christmas. We've had we've got alternatives to alcohol. They don't like alcohol, but they don't rot your liver and your gut and your brain, etc. And you don't get so much of a hangover. And they're reversible. I mean, it's perfect. The question is, how do you develop it? And the answer is, in Britain, we can't develop it because, de facto, it is now illegal. So we are thinking about going overseas because, and you guys will just have to die of your liver cirrhosis and the rest of the world can live longer. Maybe that's a good point to end. Thank you all very much.
I'm an old man now, I'm 65, so I've been around for a long time. Back in the 1970s, I was a journalist, and my interest at that time was entirely in current affairs. I had no interest in the past at all. I was the East Africa correspondent for The Economist in the early 1980s. I was based in Nairobi in Kenya. My beat as their correspondent took me frequently to Ethiopia, which was very much in the news in those days. And in Ethiopia, I came across an incredible story. Ethiopia claims to possess the lost Ark of the Covenant, as in Raiders of the Lost Ark, which in the early 1980s, as it happened, I had just seen. So I found myself in front of this monk in a city called Aksum in northern Ethiopia, then in the midst of a war zone. And he's telling me that behind him in this chapel is the Ark of the Covenant. And part of me is thinking, come on. And part of me is thinking, there's a story here. And I started to follow that story. I was told by academics there was nothing to it, but at the same time I could see that this idea that the Ark of the Covenant was in Ethiopia was central to Ethiopian culture, was central to the ancient form of Christianity practiced in Ethiopia, and was central to the religion of the Ethiopian Jews as well, the people who call themselves Beta Israel, or the House of Israel, who practice a very Old Testament form of Judaism. So I started to think, the academics are telling me there's nothing to this, but I think there is something to it. The truth on the ground is much different from what the scholars are saying. And I began to investigate it very, very closely. And that investigation drew me in two directions. It drew me into the ancient past and the mysteries of the past, and it made me realize that everything scholars say is not necessarily true, that they are often expressing their prejudices rather than really researched work. So it was that was my initiation into the past. It was a process. To write that book, I also needed to travel to Egypt, and I found myself in front of the Great Pyramid for the first time. It had an extraordinary effect on me. I began to look into the details of it, the statistics, the precision of the structure. And again, I looked at what the academics were saying, and it sounded like utter rubbish to me. So I felt there's a place for further investigation here, and that eventually led on to my best-known book, which is Fingerprints of the Gods, that was published in 1995. By that time, I was fully drawn in to the mystery and magic of the past and completely separated from current affairs. And I've continued that relationship with the past. I think that's where we need to disentangle the truth most urgently, because if we've got our past wrong, then that's part of why we've got our present wrong as well. Well, how did communities and civilizations begin to form is a question that takes us back to the roots of human experience. Humans are naturally social animals. We live in groups. None of us really have the resources as individuals to function and survive in the world. We have those resources as a community. And I think you can trace the human story as far back as you can possibly trace it, and you're going to find that community is part of it. And for a very long time, those communities were communities of hunter-gatherers. And it's interesting, if you go back to the Upper Paleolithic, that we find almost no evidence for warfare. We find almost no evidence for the greedy acquisition of material goods, rather a living in harmony with nature and a living off the land, but living as a community, small communities which are self-sufficient, which interrelate with other communities, but which do not make war upon them. There's no sign of that. Something else enters the human story in the period that academics call the Neolithic, when we get supposedly, and I think this whole history needs to be looked at very, very carefully, but when we get supposedly the first agricultural communities that are, unlike hunter-gatherer communities, these agricultural communities are generating surpluses. Those surpluses allow specialist skills to emerge. Astronomers, priests, architects, designers can suddenly be supported by the community and can exercise their skills in the benefit of the community. That sounds like a really good thing, but it's unfortunately in the Neolithic, exactly when that begins to happen, that we get the evidence for warfare, for one community seeking to dominate and control another. And I think what a long look at the past says is that that is not inevitable to the human condition. We don't have to go that way. We can live in organized societies. We can benefit from large communities pooling their intelligence and their skills. We can benefit from all of that without becoming destructive and murderous. It's a matter of waking up and making the choice. Why did communities create temples? The temple is something that is associated with organized hierarchical religion. You do not get temples in hunter-gatherer societies. In a sense, their temple is the universe. Their temple is the sacred Mother Earth and the sacred Father Sky. Those are the temples of hunter-gatherer communities. They don't need to build structures to perhaps amplify experience. They are already through some kind of religious structure. And that is not necessarily a bad thing. If you look at ancient Egypt, really, which is a culture that actually enshrines many of the values of hunter-gatherer societies, much more than many academics would realize, it was also a hierarchical and organized society. They understood something about sky and ground, about as above, so below. They understood how to create sacred spaces in which the human experience of mystery and of the divine could be amplified. And these sacred spaces include the great temples of Upper Egypt, the Temple of Horus at Edfu, for example, the Temple of Seti I at Abydos in Upper Egypt. These are amazing places. The moment that you enter them, you can feel that something's working on your consciousness. Even today, thousands of years after they were decommissioned, after they ceased to be part of a functioning society, they still reach out to us and touch us at an extremely deep level. The Great Pyramid is the classic example of that. The lie told by archaeologists is that the Great Pyramid was the tomb of some megalomaniac pharaoh. It's been clear to me for a very long time that the Great Pyramid was never a tomb. The Great Pyramid was a giant instrument for amplifying human consciousness, and it functions as a beacon. It still functions. It selects its own initiates. For some people, it's just a heap of stones. For others, it's a sacred mystery, and those are the ones that the Great Pyramid speaks to, and it was designed to do that. So, although the creation of temples and sacred architecture is the work of organized hierarchical societies, we have the example particularly of ancient Egypt, which tells us that that work can be good. It can touch the human soul in a wonderful, thought out, beautiful way. It's not an accident. The historian Herodotus visited Egypt. Herodotus reported that the Egyptians were the happiest people that he had ever encountered anywhere on earth. And this is a civilization that devoted its best minds for 3,000 years to considering the mystery of life and death and the mystery of existence, and found a beautiful way to function in the world. You get a new force coming into the world, and those are the monotheistic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, which rapidly ceased to be about direct spiritual contact. Those sacred temples of Egypt were not about enhancing the power of the priesthood. They were about giving individuals the additional support to access mystery. What we have in the big monotheistic faith is something very different. We have the priests and the rabbis and the mullahs who are imposing themselves between us and the divine. We are to only experience the divine with their permission, their way, through their system, and no other way. And this then ceases to be something that serves the human spirit, and it becomes something that's part of the system of control in our society. So what I observe is that sacred spaces and temples have become denaturized as time has gone on. They've become a home of bureaucracy rather than a home of spiritual experience. How do I think the pyramids were built? To be honest, I have no answer to that question. And anybody who tells you that he or she knows how the pyramids were built are not telling the truth, because we don't know. We don't know. The Great Pyramid contains a number of mysteries. The Great Pyramid, first of all, is very big. The Great Pyramid weighs 6 million tons. We can calculate that from its mass. It weighs 6 million tons. Its footprint is 13 acres. It's more than 750 feet along each side. Individual blocks of stone were used in its construction. But it's not just big. The Great Pyramid is locked in to the cardinal dimensions of our planet. The Great Pyramid is targeted on true north within 3/60ths of a single degree. Now, no modern builder would create a large building and add onto his or her shoulders the additional burden of aligning it to true north within a fraction of a single degree. They just wouldn't get it. They wouldn't understand why it was important to do that. But something drove the builders of the Great Pyramid to go to a very great additional trouble, not only to create this massive, imposing monument, but also to lock it on to true north. And then other things, to incorporate into its dimensions the dimensions of our planet. I don't want to get too numerical or possibly even boring here, but if you take the height of the Great Pyramid and multiply it by 43,200, you get the polar radius of the Earth. And if you measure the base perimeter of the Great Pyramid accurately and multiply that measurement by 43,200, you get the equatorial circumference of the Earth. In other words, for thousands of years, through times, through dark ages, when human beings didn't even know they lived on a planet, never mind its dimensions, that monument has encoded and speaks out the dimensions of our planet on a scale of 1 to 43,200. And the scale is not random. The number 43,200 is derived from a key motion of the Earth, which is called the precession of the Earth's axis. The Earth wobbles on its axis very slowly at the rate of 1 degree every 72 years. And 43,200 is a multiple of 72. In fact, I think it's 600 times 72, but I need to double check that. But it's a multiple of 72. Check it out. So they've given us the dimensions of our planet on a scale defined by the planet itself. And that's an incredibly clever thing to do. How on earth did they do it? Where did that knowledge come from? This is why I'm forced to consider the possibility of a lost civilization in the human story. This is a work of almost, but not quite, space-age precision. It contains errors, but they are human errors for sure, but they're very tiny. The great precision, great skill, great craft. Some people will say to you, oh, the Great Pyramid was built by slaves. That is utter bullshit. No slaves were ever involved in the construction of the Great Pyramid. As far as I know, there were no slaves in Old Kingdom Egypt whatsoever. The Great Pyramid, I've climbed it 5 times. I've been in every known chamber in the Great Pyramid. It is a work of stunning artistic achievement. You're looking at the work of masters of architecture at the peak of their skill. Not an unwilling labor force, but people who gave their labor to that work with love and with care and with attention. There are blocks of stone weighing 70 tons that have been raised more than 300 feet above the ground. And we're not talking a couple of blocks, we're talking dozens of blocks of that weight. The average block weighs about 2.5 tons. It's the moving of those huge blocks of stone, their arrangement into a high precision monument, and the achievement of actually doing it, because you know, if you make a small mistake at the base, by the time you get to the summit of your 481-foot high pyramid, you don't have a pyramid, you have a corkscrew. You know? They got it all right, and nobody today can explain how they did it, with the knowledge that is supposed to have been available in ancient Egypt, in the Old Kingdom, and with the tools that are supposed to have been available. And that's why I can't help feeling that we are missing some chapter from the human story. Do I think music is a global impulse? Absolutely yes. Music is fundamental to the human creature. We are connected to music, through music, with music in extraordinary and deep ways. It is not an accident, for example, that music, the songs that are called Icaros, are used in ayahuasca ceremonies in the Amazon. They're not a sideline. The singing of those songs is central to the ayahuasca ceremony and to the ayahuasca experience. And when you're in the grip of the brew, in a deep visionary state, those songs become roads. They become pathways. They materialize. You can see them. And you find yourself following them. They're leading you in I think music alone is capable of bringing about altered states of consciousness if we engage with it properly, capable of touching us in our emotional centers in a way that almost nothing else is. I think music is a sacred exercise for humanity, and perhaps we need to recover that notion a little bit and to sacralize music again. Yeah. I don't really know of any ancient civilization which achieved a high level of functioning which didn't use psychedelics. Psychedelics were astonishingly widely used in the ancient world, and used very carefully, with great attention being paid to what we now call set and setting. So, for example, you can go to Chavin de Huantar, about 200 miles north of Lima, turn right, drive up into the Andes, 14,000 feet, drop down into the Chavin Valley, and you'll find yourself in an ancient archaeological site, the largest part of which are galleries below the ground, which were used in ceremony in ancient times, and that ceremony involved the San Pedro cactus. It involved, in which mescaline is the active ingredient. When the conquistadors came there, they couldn't understand what all this was about. Why had they created these great galleries? What was going on? We now know what was going on. They were creating a setting that would maximize the effect of the psychedelic of choice, which in their case was the San Pedro cactus. If you go to Eleusis in ancient Greece, it's a ruin now outside of Athens. But for more than 2,000 years, until the 4th century after Christ, Eleusis was the beating heart of the ancient Greek world. And again, like Chavin de Huantar, it turns out that there are enormous underground galleries, darkened spaces, which they called the telestrion. We now know what was going on there. The initiates in the Eleusinian mysteries came and drank a brew before they went down into the telestrion. That brew essentially was LSD. It was a non-poisonous form of ergot growing on barley, which they then harvested and cooked up in the brew called the kykeon. So no wonder when people went down into the telestrion, into those darkened spaces which were subtly lit here and there, that they would have life-transforming experiences. Plato was an initiate, Sophocles was an initiate, Cicero was an initiate, Pindar was an initiate. They all said that the experience they had had in the telestrion after drinking the brew was life-changing. They lost utterly their fear of death. They knew that death was not the end, but just the beginning of the next great adventure. And those spaces were the heart of everything that was good and worthy and worthwhile about ancient Greek culture. And it's a comment upon the way that civilization has gone, that it was fanatical early Christianity that destroyed Eleusis and that put an end to those rites that had been so life-affirming and so life-enhancing for so long. And this is true, frankly, all around the world, whether you go to ancient India, whether you go to ancient Mexico, of course to ancient South America. In South America, we have a whole pyramid city called Caral, which has only been excavated in the last 15 years. And you know, archaeologists went to it with their prejudices. Nobody could have created a huge place like this unless they were highly domineering and hierarchical and making war on others. Turns out there's no evidence of warfare whatsoever at Caral, but what there is evidence of is the massive use of hallucinogenic snuffs from the Amazon. So this great culture that built the largest pyramids ever created in the New World, pyramids that are 5,000 years old, This great culture was founded upon and based upon the import of hallucinogenic snuffs from the Amazon and the free interrelation of peoples without any warfare. You can find this all around the world. Psychedelics have been central to human culture from the very beginning, and I think that goes right back to the Stone Age, to the Upper Paleolithic. There's a moment when a light seems to go on in our ancestors' heads all around the world, and they start producing art that is definitive of visionary experiences. They are depicting visionary experiences. And that's the moment that we get this huge step forward in the evolution of human behavior. We're already anatomically modern, but the software wasn't there. It looks like it was psychedelics that provided the software, that brought about modern human consciousness. We are now in a process of reversion from that. We need to correct that course. We need to return to the course of expanded consciousness, of dissolved boundaries, of openness to the universe, and to the spirit of love and nurture, which is fundamental to the human experience. Look, we're creatures of this planet. We are bound into the rhythms of this planet, and the ultimate, obvious, immediate, present rhythm is the rhythm of day and night. That for some hours, the side of the planet we're sitting on faces the sun, and as it revolves, it then faces darkness. So we have night and day, and it's part of all our biorhythms. I mean, you try and ignore night and day for too long, and you'll find that it has a very disturbing effect on your psyche. So I think we should never forget that we're creatures of the earth. We are part of this sacred realm, this gorgeous, beautiful garden of a planet. You know, this blue, lush, wondrous, beautiful planet that is floating like a bubble in space and preserving life. So of course we're part of the planet. We're not aliens here. We belong here. We emerged from this planet. We are, in a way, an important part of the consciousness of this planet. I'm not saying we're the only part. Consciousness is everywhere, but we're an important part of it. And because we have made ourselves so powerful, almost to the point where humanity has become a geological force, our consciousness and our behavior is a really important matter to consider if we're considering the future of the planet. So we should never forget, this planet is our home. We emerged from it. And this is, in my view, not an accidental process. It's a part of the whole universe coming awake. We are locked into the rhythms of this planet, whether it's night and day, whether it's the annual course of the Earth around the sun, which gives us the seasons. Beautifully and amazingly, the Earth is tilted on its axis at an angle of 23.5 degrees. For that reason, we have seasons. If the Earth was perfectly upright on its axis, we would not have seasons. But we have seasons because of the tilt. It's almost as though the universe conspired to create a beautiful home for life. It's almost like it was a project to create a place where life could flourish, where consciousness could grow and consciousness could develop. We need to remember that we're part of the earth, we're part of the consciousness of the earth, but we also need to remember that other forces are at work which seek to shut human consciousness down. And part of our duty and part of our responsibility as creatures of the earth is to resist those forces that shut down our consciousness, because it's the earth that has given us our consciousness. So, in order to answer that question, I need to refer you to an ancient body of ideas. And that ancient body of ideas is called Gnosticism. Gnosticism means knowledge, but the Gnostics were not talking about the kind of knowledge you get from reading books, or that you study in school or in university. They were talking about revelation, about revealed knowledge, which comes through experience and can come in an instant. Psychedelics, as a matter of fact, are one of the effective ways of reintroducing us to gnosis. No longer do we count on the expert to tell us what we're experiencing or what the experience means. We have the experience ourselves, and that experience is transformatory. Now, the Gnostics believed, and I'm simply reporting to you their belief, that we live in a friend of mine actually calls this world a university of duality. He's touching on Gnostic ideas there, because the Gnostics believed that the fundamental character of this level of existence is duality, that there is dark and light, that there is good and evil, and that good and evil are not simple social constructs, that they are fundamental to the essence of life at this level of existence. It doesn't mean that we have something to learn from duality. Duality forces us to make choices. We don't think about it a lot, but actually every minute of every day, we are making choices, sometimes very small, sometimes very large, between good and evil. We are making choices about how we live in the world, about how we function, about how we relate to others. And the Gnostics saw this as a teaching and a learning process. Part of that learning process is that there is a force at work in the universe which seeks to snuff out the divine spark in humanity, which seeks to deny the growth of our consciousness. That's an unfortunate side of dualism. They called this force the demiurge. And they said that the demiurge had evil angels working for him, who they called archons. And those evil angels, they worked to limit and suppress and destroy human consciousness. And the project of Gnosticism was to bring illumination, for us to understand, to realize what our true condition is, and why it's extremely important that we make choices for good rather than for evil. The essential notion of Gnosticism is that there are forces at work impacting upon us which are good and nurturing and beautiful and true, and there are other forces at work impacting upon us which are evil and deadly and destructive and dangerous. And our position, our situations as human beings, is that we must choose between the two. The demiurgic forces are clever. They work to limit human choice. They work to persuade us that there is no choice to make. And that's why I think that we find ourselves in this situation where we are confronted by evil all the time, sometimes on a very grand scale, a global scale. To me, it seems obvious that some kind of evil is at work when we can have so much wealth in Western cultures, so much prosperity, and yet close our minds and eyes to the fact that half the human race is living in a state of desperate deprivation, where every day is a struggle for existence, where they have no time to do anything else except to struggle to keep body and soul together for another day. We have political forces at work in our society which seek to persuade us that warfare is right, that we should go and make war on other peoples because they disagree with us on some idea or another. The Gnostics would have understood that immediately as the demiurge at work, misguiding us, seeking to divorce us from our true essential selves. The same goes for big corporations, you know, and for the so-called nanny state, the state which seeks to deprive us of all responsibility, to make choices for us. That's why I would say that we live in a time of extraordinary importance right now. As far as we know, it's the first time that there's been a global human conversation going on. And that global human conversation is going on because of the internet. The internet has, you'd be surprised how far it reaches. Even in the middle of the Amazon jungle, people are on the net, you know, and they're hearing what's happening elsewhere in the world. And truly we are in a global human conversation. And that's why right now, the choices that we make as a species for good or for evil have vast importance, hugely magnified beyond the implications of those choices a couple of thousand years ago. It is actually possible for us to, and it may happen because the forces of death and destruction are very strong in our society. We may end up sterilizing the earth, destroying this beautiful planet. It's possible that we can do that. But we don't have to do it. We have the choice. We can always, each day, in each instant, make the choice for good rather than for evil. I think those are real choices. I think they matter, and I think they're part of the nature of life at this level of existence. As I say, I don't think that's all there is. The Gnostics didn't think that's all there is either. There's something beyond that, but we are here to learn, and we will be defined by our choices, and ultimately the responsibility is ours. Do I think that ancient civilizations suffered from addiction? No, I don't think so. I don't think that was a problem. There's a big mistake we make in our society with the issue of addiction. Right away, the view is that it's the substance that you get addicted to. It's not the case. The addiction is always an issue within the person who is addicted, and we all have the capacity to become addicted to something which we feel serves us in a certain way. Which makes us somehow feel good, But that is our problem. It's not a problem of the activity or the substance that we're taking. And I rather strongly believe that in the ancient world, societies were more adjusted, more balanced, were capable of providing a support system for fellow human beings, which our society does not do. So I think the problems of addiction, whether it's addiction to gambling, addiction to sex, addiction to heroin, addiction to pharmaceutical drugs, whatever it is, this is a problem that will not be solved at the level of substance. This is a problem that will be solved at the level of the person. And in order to solve it, we need a nurturing and loving society, not a society that seems to... I mean, look at what happens with heroin addicts in our society now. What do? They give them methadone, I mean, what is that for? What's that all about? Just, you're not curing an addiction, you're just addicting the person to another drug. It makes no sense whatsoever. When there are liberating instruments like ayahuasca, which can lead to personal revelation that end the addiction often overnight without any further trouble. So it's rightly said that ayahuasca is like 20 years of psychotherapy in one night. Yeah. So the question is, where does soul come from, and where do I think it goes when the body dies? This is my belief system, I can't prove this, but I feel that the what we call the soul, that is the fundamental of the human being. That is, it's not our bodies, it's not our digestive system or our brains or our skeleton. It's the soul, and the soul is non-physical. I believe the fundamental essence of consciousness is non-physical. I think consciousness is one of the basic forces of the universe, to be ranked alongside gravity and electromagnetism. It's a fundamental force of the universe. And again, I can only tell you my own belief system. I think that this physical realm was created by non-physical consciousness. I think it's a place in which non-physical consciousness can manifest in the physical experience and can live a life where there are physical consequences, where choices have to be made. In other words, the physical realm is a place where souls learn to grow and develop. And they do that by incarnating in physical bodies, not necessarily only human bodies. Let's not pretend that animals are not also souls. Of course a dolphin is a soul. Of course a fruit fly is a soul, even though it has a limited time here. There's a limited experience to be undergone which can help it to grow. I think that's what's going on in the physical world. I think that it's a place of learning and development of the soul. So where do souls come from? They are always there. They are the essence of the universe. Where do they go to when physical life ends? Back to the place where they came from, which is not a place, which is everywhere, which is everything. But it's everywhere where it's not possible to have the learning experience of being incarnated in a physical body. I happen to think we come back. I think this incredible opportunity of a human life would be rather wasteful if it were only one life that we had. I think we come back for many lives, and the cards are randomly dealt. We may come back in the next life with a totally different stack of cards from the ones we came into in this life, and that's good, because that's how we learn, that's how we grow. But the deal with reincarnation is you must forget your former life. If you remembered it, if you knew the rules of the game, you would no longer be able to play the game straight. So that's why the ancient Greeks said that we drink the waters of forgetfulness.
Unless you came back as something else, non-human form.
Unless you came
back as something in a non-human form, as an animal or a...
Well, you might well come back in an animal form, and who knows, there might be a great deal to learn from life as a wolf or life as a sheep. It is possible, and let's not forget that also there is likely to be life on other planets in this vast universe. Maybe we come back on other planets in totally other bodies altogether. In short, I think that the entire universe is a theater of experience for the soul. It's a vast enterprise that involved the creation of a material realm and a level of existence where the vibration is lower than it is at the level of non-physical consciousness. And we come down into that physical level of existence. We learn the lessons here, we make our mistakes, and we carry on until perhaps we reach some kind of resolution. We reach a point where we're ready to move on to the next level. That's how I see it. I can't prove it. Maybe it's not so, but it makes sense to me. Holotropic breath work, for example. So you're asking me if the profoundly altered states of consciousness that we reach through the use of psychedelics can be reached in other ways, and you're giving the specific example of breath work. Yeah. Well, yes, actually. Psychedelics are not the only way to enter deeply altered states of consciousness that can be life-transforming. It's the altered state of consciousness that really matters, and there are really quite a lot of ways of reaching it. In fact, nature seems to have taken what used to be called a belt and braces approach to this. It's provided us with lots of ways to be sure that we do access altered states of consciousness. One of the things that suggests to me that altered states of consciousness are a fundamental part of the human birthright, and that any society that seeks to demonize those states of consciousness is making a very radical mistake. So, for example, the San Bushmen of southern Africa, the Kalahari Bushmen in Namibia, they entered deeply altered states of consciousness and communicate with entities and travel through the sky and can spot herds of game at distances of hundreds of miles by doing that. Not by taking a psychedelic, but by doing a dance around a fire. A dance, they call it the trance dance. It can last 24 hours.
Wow.
The shaman becomes completely bathed in sweat. He enters a deeply altered, then he'll take his sweat and wipe it on another person, and the trance passes to that other person instantly. It's a really extraordinary thing. No medicines, no plants are used, entirely dance. And perhaps the dehydration that comes with the dance and brings about those changes in the brain that lead to a deeply altered state of consciousness without the use of any plants. I know that Stanislav Grof developed holotropic breath work after he was stopped using LSD. His practice was with LSD, psychotherapy with LSD. When that was made illegal, he developed breath work as another way of accessing those states. I'm not sure that everybody can get into those states using breath work or using the trance dance or using meditation or fasting for 4 weeks. You know, there are many ways to get into those states, but not everybody can access a deeply altered state of consciousness. And for those of us who can't access a deeply altered state of consciousness by dancing around a fire for 24 hours, mind you, I don't know if I can or can't because I've never danced around a fire for 24 hours, but the plants are there. They're our allies. They are available to us to access those states if there's no other way for us to access them. And even if there is another way to access them, we should also consider the plants. They are there, they are our friends, they are our allies. Some people say, I've heard people despise the plants and say, oh, you should be able to reach your deeply altered state of consciousness by entirely natural means. Hang on, what's more natural than a plant, really? I mean, we are creatures of this earth. The plants have co-evolved with us. Why would we regard meditation or the trance dance as a superior way of act? There's not a superior way. There is no superior or inferior. There is just generous nature, bountiful nature, which has equipped us with many ways to reach the states of consciousness that allow us to transcend and to understand what it is we're involved in here. The most important thing that we can teach our children is think for yourself. Never accept any idea off the peg. Just because it comes from a respected individual or Dr. X or Professor Y or a government figure or anybody. Just because it comes from Graham Hancock. Don't accept any ideas off the peg. Think for yourself. Work things out. That's what your brain is for. Use it. Get out there. Exercise it. Never react in an automatic, impulsive way, but think why you're reacting in the way you react. Often you'll find that institutions, organizations in our society are deliberately pressing buttons designed to provoke knee-jerk reactions. And the knee-jerk reaction is the last thing of being human. We have to react in a thought-out way and understand what we're doing. So the most important message for young people is think for yourselves, equip yourself with the tools to think for yourself. Never rely on any guru. Never put your trust in any individual who says that he or she knows how things are, because nobody really knows how things are. We're all on our individual life journey, and we're not here to be meat robots doing the business of the state or the big corporations. We are here to have an experience that will have, I believe, a profound long-term effect beyond this life on ourselves and on the universe as a whole. It's a sacred purpose that we're here to fulfill. And we have been equipped with certain facilities, including intelligence, in order to fulfill that sacred purpose. Use it. Think for yourself. Be your own leader. You don't need leaders. Why do we need leaders? Why do we need to be led? I've heard some say, oh, well, most people need leaders. Why do most people need leaders? We all have these huge brains. We all have this heart and this soul. What do we need to be led for? And when we look at the work of leaders over the centuries, over the millennia, there's very little in it that's good. Most of it's bad and harmful. Most of it's about the ego of the leader. I think that we're coming to a time in the human story when we need to dispense with leadership. We need to realize that we are our own guides and our own leaders. And if we do that, then the future will be much brighter than if we stay locked in the old paradigm of top-down control, structure, hierarchy, leadership and gurus.
Yeah, in order to do that, though, we need a global understanding of the ego.
A global understanding of the ego and personal understanding of the ego too.
Yeah, in a personal, individual way.
Yeah, we need that. We absolutely do. And our society, constructed as the Gnostics would have said by demiurgic forces to shut us down, is not allowing that to happen at the moment. That's why we have to take that next step. You know, we have to detach ourselves from the existing order of things. The existing order of things is profoundly negative for the human spirit. There's nothing in it that's good as far as I can see. It's all bad. And it comes first from saying, I am a free individual. I am here to learn. I am here on a sacred journey. Nobody should get in the way of that. Nobody should tell me how to run my journey. I should run my journey myself. How do music, dance, and festivities benefit human development? Well, Unfortunately, music and dance and festivities at the moment are not being used with the intention of benefiting human development. They've fallen into the entertainment paradigm of the dominator system that we live in. While that is our intent, while our intent is simply to be entertained, nothing wrong with being entertained, it's great to be entertained. But if we want to make progress with this, then I think we need to have a more thought out intent from the experience that we're having. What I do see at festivals is a kind of microcosm of the whole human experience. We have beauty and truth in festivals. We have wonderful, nurturing individuals who are there for others, you know, and we have others who are pretty selfish and mean. I don't remember which festival it was I was at, but it was a very muddy one, and there was a muddy track that people were walking along, and it was on a hill, and up on the hill there were a whole lot of people sitting like in an audience. They were watching, and they were watching intently as the next person walked along. And sure, it's so deep that only his head was above the hole, filled with water and mud. And what did the audience do? They all laughed. Ah! They were entertained by this. Now, that's most unfortunate. What they should have been doing is saying, watch out, mate, there's a hole there that you're going to fall into. Nobody was saying that. So I'm afraid negative behavior occurs at festivals as well as positive behavior. But what I do see at festivals, whether it's Glastonbury, whether it's the Boom Festival, whether it's Burning Man, which I've attended and had extraordinary experiences there as well, is that some kind of new spirit is emerging. Some kind of creativity is being expressed. This is if you like, it's a temporary gathering of people who are brought together by a community of ideas, and that ultimately has got to be a good thing. It's got to be, and it is a catalyst for change and for rethinking society. But we shouldn't think that just by coming to a festival we're going to be playing a part in that. We have to have intent. We have to live a conscious life at festivals and everywhere else. My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for being here. It was fascinating to listen to Professor David Nutt just now. I've just come from America, and it's interesting what's happening there. In a state like Colorado, you can actually be treated like an adult. It's a really interesting thing. America was at the power behind the war on drugs. And yet, state by state in America, the war on drugs is being wrecked and destroyed by the people themselves. The people are stopping the war on drugs. I wish we had the same kind of system in Britain where, I don't know, Yorkshire or Somerset could put one finger up to central government and say, fuck you, we're going to make cannabis legal. You know, and maybe that's what's needed. You know, we stop. Maybe there's some kind of revolution in the making here. Our governments are so determined to impose these insane policies upon us that the whole creditworthiness of government in every way becomes suspect if it was not suspect already. I'm here to ask the question and try to offer some answers. Whether do psychedelics matter? And obviously, I think that psychedelics matter a great deal. Let me start with a little bit of my personal story. My first experience with psychedelics was LSD in 1974, probably before most of you were born, at a thing called the Windsor Free Festival. I went there with 3 friends. I didn't know anything about psychedelics, but we were offered this little tablet which we cut into 3 pieces, and then we had 1/3 of it each. And I had an absolutely amazing experience that night. The Windsor Free Festival was a bit like Glastonbury, actually. And I regard that event as the true end of the 1960s. I spent the entire night, 12 hours, just walking around this amazing festival, and I found myself transported back in time. I convinced myself that I was back in the Viking Age, and that each encampment that I came to with these long-haired people was a little Viking encampment. I had all kinds of adventures. I found a tree in which I believed that there was a giant spider, and the giant spider was wrapping people up in cocoons. At the same time, I realized that those cocoons were sleeping bags. I carried on walking all night. It was amazing. I found myself talking to flowers, communing with the stars. It was just an incredibly beautiful, mind-opening, very powerful experience. When I got back to the tent, I found that one of my 3 friends was sitting there in the tent in a state of total collapse. He'd had an absolutely horrific night. He was terrified. There was no meaning in life. And so I said, well, look, come for a walk. Let's go for a walk. And we walked around, and off through the fields in the distance, I saw what I took to be a line of blue elves who were walking towards us, waving some kind of sticks. And I turned to my friend and I said, what the fuck are those elves doing there? And he said, those aren't fucking elves, those are policemen. And I said, are you serious? And he said, yeah, and they're coming this way, we better run. And actually they smashed up that entire festival. And that's why I regard it as the real end of the 1960s. Now, after that, I looked at my friend and his experience. While I say this, let me just tell a small anecdote about the late, great Terence McKenna. And this anecdote is told to me by my friend Luis Eduardo Luna, who knew Terence from the early 1970s, and Luis is a shaman with whom I frequently drink ayahuasca. Lewis tells this story about Terence, that Terence had taken a heroic dose of psilocybin. However, nothing was happening. And he was saying to himself, it's not strong enough. It's not strong enough. So he took another heroic dose of psilocybin. And sometime afterwards, the universe began to melt down around him in a state of total chaos and collapse. And then a voice spoke in his ear and said, "Is that strong enough for you, asshole?" So after my LSD experience, I was frankly afraid, although I'd had a wonderful experience. I thought, what happens if that experience went the other way? What happened if I had an experience like my friend had? And for many, many years after that, although I became a regular user of cannabis, I never took another psychedelic. And in fact, I didn't take another psychedelic until 2003. That's how many years is that? 30 years later. And the reason I initially did so was that I was writing a book called Supernatural, Meetings with the Ancient Teachers of Mankind, which looked at the role of altered states of consciousness in the human experience. And I've always felt as a writer that I can't authentically write about anything if I don't have the experience myself. I was interested in rock and cave art around the world, and the suggestion that this was inspired by visionary experiences in psychedelic states. And lo and behold, I discovered that in the Amazon jungle in South America, shamans use ayahuasca to enter deeply altered states of dream that they have seen in their visions. And this is exactly what was suggested about cave art. So it was obvious to me that I had to go to the Amazon and I had to drink ayahuasca. So I found myself in early 2004 in the Amazon rainforest, in a clearing with half a dozen other people and a shaman, and I'm given this truly smelly and disgusting tasting brew to drink. How many here have drunk ayahuasca? Yeah, I mean, well, those who've drunk it will know that it's not an easy thing to drink. It tastes bad. Maybe a mixture of essence of old socks, some raw sewage, a bit of sulfur, some battery acid, and just a hint of chocolate. After about 45 minutes, your system begins to feel decidedly strange. You feel perhaps a little nauseous, a little ominous rumblings in the stomach, and you realize that you're not quite where you were before. It's very difficult to deal with the physical aspects of ayahuasca, particularly in the jungle. They call it the purge for a very good reason, is that it makes you shit buckets, basically. And I found myself after about an hour and a half, not in a deeply visionary state, but desperately needing to have a shit. And you know, we Brits are very inhibited, and it seemed very odd that I was going to just, like, in earshot of these people, I was going to go behind a tree and drop my pants and relieve myself. But there was no other alternative. I had to do that. So I did so, and while I'm squatting there, I look up at this tree and realize that the spider I'm looking at actually isn't there. It's in my head. And I come back to the circle, and that's when I discovered that the most important aspect of ourselves is not our bodies. That's one of the lessons that ayahuasca teaches, that it's not our bodies that are important, it's our consciousness. And what's happening at the level of consciousness, when you allow it in, when you surrender to the experience, is utterly extraordinary and transformatory. I carried on. I had a series of 11 sessions with ayahuasca in the Amazon. It gave me enough material to write my book, but it also taught me that I had very far to go, that I had enrolled in some kind of school, the school of Mother Ayahuasca, and the school had lessons to teach me about myself and about the nature of reality. I have never regarded reality the same since I began to work with ayahuasca. And so I've continued the work. I try to have 1 or 2, sometimes as many as 5 sessions with ayahuasca each year. And I'm doing that because I still feel that I have many lessons to learn. Ayahuasca is a wonderfully socially integrative medicine. It teaches us who we are and the impact that we have upon others. And it urges us to look at that impact and to make ourselves better, more nurturing, more positive human beings. This is really a universal experience with ayahuasca. People who drink ayahuasca anywhere in the world find themselves reviewing their own conduct and looking for ways to make themselves better people, to be more helpful and more useful to others. So why on earth would any society like ours seek to make ayahuasca and other psychedelics illegal? Why would it do that when the effects of these substances are incredibly positive and helpful and truly and honestly do help us to be more nurturing, more positive, more loving human beings? It's not a magic pill. It's not like you drink ayahuasca and get instant enlightenment. What it is the beginning of a long process of work. It's one thing to get the understanding, to understand what you need to do, what you need to change. It's another thing to integrate those changes into your life and actually act them out. And that's where the work comes. That's where it's really not easy at all. It's very, very difficult to change a lifetime of bad habits. But ayahuasca offers us a way to do so. I'm not saying it's the only way. There's lots of other ways to do so. But maybe in a highly materialistic, controlling, dominated society, maybe many of us really need the help of the ancient and sacred plants to break our minds free from the chains that have been imposed upon them. Because we do clearly live in an insane society. The society that we live in is, by any definition, psychopathically insane and unconscious and massive forces are at work using our tax money to keep things that way. This insanity is evident at a global level. Only a truly psychopathically insane global human society would allow warfare to occur at all. The fact that wars occur, the fact that we can be persuaded to go and kill other people in other lands should not be regarded as normal. This is deeply abnormal. It's a sign of a society that's gone terribly wrong. And then there's the issue of the rainforests. What kind of global society is it that can stand by and allow the precious resource of biodiversity that is the Amazon, that sacred realm, just stand by and allow it to be destroyed, allow those trees to be cut down, great clearances to take place, to grow soya beans, to feed cattle, so that some of us can eat hamburgers. Not me, because I'm a vegetarian, but, some of us. What kind of society could allow that? A rational, conscious, sane society would look at the economic predicament of the peoples of the Amazon and say to them, you are amidst one of the most precious resources on earth. We would like to make your lives easy so that resource can be looked after, nurtured for the whole planet. But we don't do that. There's no initiative at all to do anything like that. Instead, what's the big money going into? The big money is going into weapons of mass destruction so that we can come up with ever more cunning and devious ways to murder one another on a global scale. no problem in raising trillions of dollars for battleships and aircraft carriers and fighter aircraft and helicopters, any machine which can be used to destroy fellow human beings. We have no problem raising money for that. But to raise the money to make it worthwhile for the peoples of the Amazon never to allow another tree to be cut down, we can't even begin to think about that idea. And it would be peanuts by comparison with the expenditure of global pollution. That we're poisoning this beautiful garden of a planet on which we live. We're poisoning it at a vast collective level, and nobody's taking any responsibility for that. And at the level of individuals, our society encourages us to be producers and consumers of material goods and nothing more. It encourages us to identify our egos with what we own rather than with who we are. It encourages us to put ourselves first and everybody else second. And these to me are all symptoms of a global society that is completely and utterly insane. We have passed, I think, the moment, the time in history when nationalism was of any use. And yet, in the tendencies that are at work in the world today, there is more and more focus on nation and on patriotism. Why, I ask myself, why should I feel this emotion of patriotism? Why should I want on the same piece of land as me? Which means that their parents fucked on the same piece of land that my parents fucked on. Why does that make them have anything special in common with me? Why should I be willing to actually go out and kill people of other nations just because I was born accidentally in this nation? It's a symptom of a deeper problem, which is the creation of artificial boundaries between us. We are all one human family. We are all brothers and sisters. You know, I have to say, Santa, who's standing over there, is a person of color. Santa was in the back of the car, I was in the front. We passed one of the stewards, and then the steward shouted, "Hey, who's that in the back?" and stopped us. And I realized immediately what was going on, because that happens again and again, that racial profiling was going on, and that person saw a person of color and decided that they might be suspect in some way. I don't think that person was consciously racist, but that racism is deeply ingrained in the psyche, and it's part of these artificial boundaries that are created. Wherever I travel in the world, I find that people are exactly the same hopes, the same fears, the same dreams, the same capacity to love. We are none of us any different. It's absurd to suggest that we are. And this new focus on nationalism is, in my view, a profoundly regressive step which is taking place. Don't get me wrong, I'm not for one world government. I'm not for any government. I'm an anarchist. We don't need governments. We don't need states telling us what to do. In my opinion, the role of government in our society needs to be wound back very, very far. And we need to start relating to one another responsibly as individuals without hiving that responsibility off onto governments who are funded with our money. It's a really most unfortunate situation that's developing in the world. And the thing is that the societies, the governments, the nations that have made drugs illegal, that have created that evil and monstrous enterprise called the war on drugs, they are the same societies that are responsible, the same governments that are responsible for all the ills that are taking place in the world. Why should we listen to a single fucking word they say? They're obviously mad. They're completely discredited in every area. They're consummate liars and deceivers. Now, as David pointed out, Psychedelics have been part of the human story since the very beginning. There's archaeological evidence for the use of ayahuasca in the Amazon going back more than 4,000 years. I'm convinced it goes much further back than that. Human society, in fact, there's a case to be made that, and Terence McKenna was one of the first to make this case, and he did so in a brilliant way in his book, Food of the Gods, that the emergence of modern human consciousness is a product of psychedelic use. It's very clear if you go back to the painted caves and you look at the cave art, the ancient art that was created there, that this is visionary art, and the emergence of this art is accompanied by what is regarded as the single most important step forward in the evolution in human behavior. That's when our ancestors seem to acquire notions of spirituality. They begin to bury grave goods, food and water with the dead. And as a matter of fact, they start burying the dead for the first time. The grave goods tell us that those societies had understood that death is not the end, that death is the beginning perhaps of the next great adventure, that some aspect of the human being survives physical death and carries on. And it comes back to this point that we are not our bodies, we are our consciousness. But one of the ways to get to grips with the mystery of consciousness is provided to us by generous nature herself in the form of the psychedelics. They are one of the most effective routes for understanding what consciousness is all about. And I think the historical context of psychedelics worldwide, up until modern times, really up until the last century, has been a context of wise and intelligent use of psychedelics for the betterment of society. It's really only us, it's only Western technological civilization with its focus on machines, with its death culture, which has made psychedelics illegal. And I don't think we should be and lie to us about psychedelics and seek to make them illegal. Because there's a really big difference between alcohol, which I regard as the most boring drug on the planet, and psychedelics. Alcohol does not lead to a questioning of the prevailing control system in our society. Alcohol serves the control system in our society. It allows people to carry on being functional producers and consumers by giving them a little holiday at the end of the day before they go back and do it all again the next day. It doesn't lead to any profound questioning about the nature of society or about why things are the way they are or about the nature of reality. Psychedelics do lead to that profound questioning. First of all, as David rightly said, they are far less dangerous than alcohol. In fact, really, psychedelics aren't dangerous at all. Sure, people can have terrifying experiences on psychedelics, but normally what happens as time goes, often I think we have to overcome our fears in order to learn. And that's why the shamans say in the Amazon, after you've drunk the brew, when that huge serpent, 300 meters long, comes towards you and opens its jaws wide, don't run away. Just dive right into those jaws. Get right into it. Nurture your courage. And this learning about courage is an important aspect of the psychedelic experience. But fundamentally, we are dealing with substances that lead to questioning of the existing control system in our society. And that is obviously regarded as very dangerous by the powers that be. And that, as David rightly said, is why we have these hysterical media campaigns, which seek to stir up. Finally has brought us to this ridiculous situation in Britain where all psychoactive substances, except the exempted ones, are illegal. Now, I can't understand how politicians can live with themselves when they allow such laws to be brought into place. I mean, we trumpet, we make a big fuss, a big noise about the idea that we live in a free society. You'll hear most of our politicians praising our democracy and its wonderful effects. Well, first of all, I'd like to make the point that the fact that we live in a democracy doesn't mean that we live in a free society at all. Actually, what it means is that we live in a very mind-controlled society, because democracy only works when you have total honesty, total transparency, complete openness, no facts hidden, no big money being put into advancing particular points of view. Instead, in our society, the opposite is true. It's secretive, hidden, occult. Huge money is put into lobbying to advance particular positions and to destroy other positions. So what triumphs in a democracy is not the best ideas. It's the ideas with the most power and money behind them. And in that sense, it's absurd to say that we live in a free society. I think we live in one of the most mind-controlled societies that has ever existed on planet Earth, which is ready to make war upon others and murder them. It is truly a psychopathic society. But another aspect of this is the very notion of freedom. What is this idea of freedom? How can politicians stand up there and say we live in a free society when at the same time they will send us to prison and ruin our lives for exploring the mystery of our own consciousness with psychedelics? There is nothing more personal, more individual, more sapient, more close to ourselves than our consciousness. And somehow, by some trick, we've been persuaded to hand over the keys of our own consciousness to the state. It's utterly, utterly meaningless to talk about freedom of any kind when we have no freedom of consciousness, when we can only assert our freedom of consciousness at personal risk by breaking laws that could lead to our imprisonment and worse. We don't have sovereignty of any sort, and therefore to me this is the society that we live in today. Fortunately, things are changing. People are waking up all around the world. It's my privilege to travel a great deal, to talk to people in many countries, and what I see everywhere are gatherings like this. People who are awake, who are conscious, who know what the fuck is going on, you know? And part of the reason we know that is because psychedelics have whispered in our ear and just brought us forward and opened the curtain a little bit. And we've seen the wizard behind the curtain. We've seen who is manipulating us. We understand that we live in a world of lies. Things are changing because people are waking up. And I'm fundamentally very optimistic about the future of humanity. I think that there is a tremendous correction underway at the moment. And it's a correction that is going to change everything. Within 2 centuries, if the human race survives, if the dominator psychopaths don't get their way, then this time will be looked back upon as a time of extraordinary, dramatic, and beautiful change in the human story. We find it hard to see that because we're caught up in the struggle of that change right now. But something amazing and something remarkable is happening, which is going to change everything. We're beginning to see some of these developments with David Nutt's research, with the very fact that against all odds and against all opposition, he's been able to do that research and bring to light more of the mysteries of psychedelics. We're beginning to see that awakening in the state-by-state legalization of cannabis in the United States. That's the people asserting themselves and saying, it is our right to make decisions about our own consciousness and our own bodies while doing no harm to others. And it's none of the fucking business of the state. The state does not belong there. The state has no place inside our heads. My hope is that the very absurdity of the drug war, the very absurdity of the ridiculous, monstrous Psychoactive Substances Act, that this very absurdity will prove to have been a step too far for the state, and that it will begin to unravel itself. In summary, I think that psychedelics matter because they're at the cutting edge of real, meaningful change in our society. If you go back 300 or 400 years, you will find a time when people who knew that the earth goes around the sun, when people who knew that and said that were called heretics. People who knew that and said that could be burnt at the stake for suggesting that actually the earth goes around the sun rather than the other way around, because until then it was believed great heresy. Galileo was forced to recant. Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake in February 1601 in Rome. They ensured that his death lasted almost 2 days. They kept the fire very slow to punish him for his absolute conviction that we live in a heliocentric solar system, that the earth goes around the sun. This was regarded as a tremendous heresy at the time, as an attack on the fundamentals of society. Giordano Bruno was presented as a monstrous, demonic figure who deserved to be burned at the stake. Well, we don't burn people at the stake anymore today, although I think there are many in our government who would like to do so. We don't burn people at the stake. Instead, we ruin their lives, imprison them, and fuck them up in every possible way for working with psychedelics and other substances. I think that those of us who are heretics today, heretics over the issue of psychedelics, we need to speak our truth. We need to speak it openly. We need to come out of the closet, even though there is personal risk, and say that these substances, used responsibly, used wisely, used in a nurturing and positive way, with love, with good intent, are incredible instruments for personal development and for realizing the nature of the universe. A fundamental shift of reference frame is underway, and that's why I think psychedelics matter, because they're absolutely central to that. We have been in a system that is focused on materialism. And when I say materialism, I don't just mean the love of material things. Materialism is a philosophy which views everything as reducible to matter, that there is no non-physical component to consciousness or to reality. As Terence McKenna said, they dissolve boundaries between us and our cat, even between us and our washing machine. Psychedelics dissolve boundaries, and they lead to a fundamental questioning of the reference frame of materialism. So it's a brilliant thing today, even if painful, even if difficult, to be a heretic. Speak out for heresy. Speak out for your truth. Speak out for the future of humanity, which is not a future of endless war, which is not a future of endless production and consumption, which is not a future of the mindless pursuit of short-term profits, but which is a future that recognizes the fundamental unity of the whole human family. We are so, thank you, we are so locked down by the society that we live in, that we desperately now need the help of the ancient and sacred plants to break out of those chains and find ourselves in the world that can be. That's why a kind of reverse missionary act